February 2, 1943, Whiten Airfield, Cambridgeshire. Wing Commander Guy Gibson stands in the operations room staring at a circular green cathode ray tube that shows something no bomber pilot has ever seen before. The city of Hamburg rendered in ghostly phosphorescent light, its docks and waterways visible through 10,000 ft of solid cloud. The device weighs 200 lb, sits in amidal box bolted to the floor of a modified Halifax bomber, and generates so much heat that the navigator operating it works in his shirt sleeves, even at 20,000 ft, where the outside temperature sits at 40 degrees and below zero. Gibson knows that in 6 hours, 300 RAF bombers will take off for Germany, carrying equipment identical to this prototype, trusting their lives and the success of the mission to a technology that has never been used in combat wasted exactly 4 times over friendly territory and exists because one physicist refused to accept that seeing through clouds was impossible. The scientist who built it never flew in a bomber, never dropped ordnance, never faced flak over the ruler, but he understood that the difference between hitting a target and missing it by 5 miles was the difference between winning and losing the strategic bombing campaign, and he built his radar knowing that if it failed, 3,000 airmen would fly blind into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, with no way to find their targets and no chance of coming home. The crisis facing RAF Bomber Command in 1942 was stark and undeniable. British bombers could not hit their targets. This was not a matter of crew skill or aircraft performance, but of fundamental physics and meteorology. Over Northern Europe, cloud cover exceeded 70% on average, and in winter, the figure rose to 85%. Bomber crews navigated by dead reckoning, estimating their position based on compass heading, airspeed, and elapsed time, correcting their estimates when they could identify landmarks on the ground through breaks in the clouds, but over Germany at night with Nolan marks visible with flak and searchlights forcing constant evasive maneuvers, and with winds aloft that varied by 50 mph from forecasted values, dead reckoning became guesswork. Bomb aimers released their loads when they thought they were over the target, and photographic reconnaissance the next day revealed the grim truth. Most bombs fell in open countryside, miles from the intended aiming point. A study conducted by Lord Cherwell in August 1941, analyzing photographs from night raids, concluded that only 1 bomber in 3 got within 5 mi of its target, and over the heavily defended Ruhr industrial region the figure dropped to 1 in 10. Britain was expending enormous resources: aircraft, fuel, bombs, and the lives of highly trained crews to plow German farmland. The problem was not new, but by 1942, it had become existential for Bomber Command's survival as an institution. The strategic bombing campaign rested on the premise that sustained aerial attacks on German industry, infrastructure, and morale with the Nazi war machine, and force a negotiated peace or at least weaken Germany sufficiently to make an Allied invasion feasible. But if bombers could not find their targets, the entire strategy collapsed into pointless attrition. Aircrew losses ran at 4 to 5% per mission, meaning that a crew's statistical chance of surviving a 30-mission tour was roughly 20%. Young men were dying in burning aircraft over Germany, and the bombs they dropped before dying achieved nothing. The political pressure on Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who assumed command of Bomber Command in February 1942, was intense. Demonstrate that strategic bombing could work, or watch Parliament redirect those resources to the Army and Navy. Harris needed a way to bomb accurately through clouds, and he needed it immediately. The solution came from an unlikely source, a Welsh physicist named Bernard Levelvelle, who had spent the pre-war years studying cosmic rays and who joined the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TR, the secret laboratory developing radar for the RAF, in 1939. But the critical breakthrough was driven by Philip D., a nuclear physicist from Cambridge and engineered into operational reality by Alan Blumen and his team at EMI. The concept they developed was called H2S, a centimetric wavelength radar that would be carried in the bomber itself, scanning the ground below and displaying the reflected signals on a cathode ray tube as a crude map. The name H2S was officially meaningless, though some claimed it stood for Home Sweet Home because it allowed bombers to navigate without ground-based transmitters, while others said it referred to hydrogen sulfide gas because one senior scientist called the idea stinking. What mattered was not the name, but the physics. Radar waves at a wavelength of 10 cm would reflect differently from water, land, buildings, and vegetation, creating contrast on the display that a trained operator could interpret as coastlines, rivers, cities, and open terrain. Unlike earlier navigation systems that relied on ground stations in England, transmitting signals that bombers received and triangulated, H-2S required nothing outside the aircraft. A bomber carrying H-2S could navigate independently anywhere over Europe in any weather, day or night. The technical challenges were immense and the timeline impossibly short. Centimetric radar required a magnetron, a device that generated high-power microwave pulses. And in 1942, the cavity magnetron was barely 3 years old, a British invention so sensitive that Churchill initially refused to share it even with the Americans for fear it would fall into German hands. The magnetron had to be coupled to a rotating antenna that scanned in a circle beneath the bomber, sending out pulses and receiving echoes from the ground below. Those echoes had to be amplified, processed, and displayed on a cathode ray tube in a format that a navigator could interpret while wearing an oxygen mask, flying through turbulence and surrounded by the noise and vibration of 4 Merlin engines running at full power. The entire system had to fit inside a bomber's fuselage, weigh less than 300 lb including the antenna housing, survive temperatures from 40 below zero to 100 degree F, withstand vibration and shock, operate reliably for 8-hour missions, and require no more maintenance than a crew chief, could perform with basic tools between sorties, and it had to be ready for operational use within 9 months, because Harris was planning a massive escalation of the bombing campaign for early 1943, and he needed H-2S to make it work. The development proceeded in parallel with operational planning, a risky approach that violated every principle of methodical testing and evaluation, but reflected the desperate urgency of the situation. TR engineers built prototype units in the summer of 1942, installing them in test aircraft and flying repeated trials over England and Scotland, where known terrain features could be compared with the radar display to verify accuracy. The early results were mixed. Cities showed up clearly, their dense concentrations of buildings producing strong radar returns that appeared as bright areas on the display. And coastlines were unmistakable, the sharp contrast between land and water, creating crisp boundaries. Rivers showed up as dark snaking lines. Forests appeared different from farmland. And rail lines sometimes produced linear echoes, but interpretation required training and experience. The display was not a photograph but an abstract representation of radar reflectivity, and distinguishing Hamburg from Bremen or identifying a specific factory complex required a skilled operator who had studied reconnaissance photographs and learned to match radar signatures to known features. The training program for H-2S operators began before the equipment was even in production, with navigators studying radar images of British cities and learning to recognize the signatures of different terrain types. The decision to deploy H-2S operationally despite limited testing was made at the highest levels and reflected a calculated gamble. Air Marshal Harris argued that even imperfect navigation was better than the current state of affairs where bombers wandered over Germany, hoping to glimpse the target through gaps in the clouds. The scientific advisors acknowledged that H-2S had not been tested under combat conditions, that the reliability of the magnetrons was uncertain, that German radar detectors might pick up H-2S transmissions and vector night fighters toward the bombers, and that a crashed aircraft could deliver the entire technology into enemy hands. Churchill himself was briefed on the risks, particularly the concern that Germany might recover an intact H-2S set and reverse engineer the magnetron, potentially leapfrogging British radar development. The Prime Minister's response was blunt. If we use this device, we might lose the war. If we do not use it, we will certainly lose the war. Production was authorized and factories began building H-2S sets in quantity, even as test flights continued. The first operational use of H-2S came on the night of January 30th, 1943, when RAF Bomber Command dispatched a force of heavy bombers to Hamburg equipped with the new radar. The target was Germany's second-largest city, a major port and industrial center on the Elbe River, and the weather forecast predicted complete cloud cover over the target area. Hamburg was chosen deliberately because its coastline and river made it an ideal H-2S target. The contrast between water and land would produce a clear radar image, even for relatively inexperienced operators. 14 steerings and Halifaxes carrying H-2 sled the bomber stream. Their navigators hunched over the glowing cathode ray tubes, watching as the English coast fell behind, and the North Sea appeared as a uniform dark area. Then the Dutch coast materialized as a bright irregular line, and finally the Elbe estuary came into view exactly where the navigators expected it. The operators called heading corrections to their pilots, guiding the leading aircraft toward the aiming point. And when the radar showed they were over the city center, the bomb aimers released their loads. The main force following behind saw the marker flares dropped by the H-2S-equipped Pathfinders and bombed on those markers, concentrating their attack in a way that had been impossible in previous raids. Photographic reconnaissance the next day revealed that the raid had been the most accurate Bomber Command had achieved to date. Bomb damage was concentrated in the industrial districts along the waterfront and in the city center, rather than scattered across the surrounding countryside. The concentration was not perfect. Many bombs still fell outside the target area, but the improvement over previous raids was dramatic and unmistakable. More importantly, the raid demonstrated that H-2S worked under operational conditions, that navigators could interpret the display while under stress, that the equipment survived the vibration and temperature extremes of combat flying, and that the bombers carrying H-2S could find and mark targets that would have been impossible to locate by visual means. Harris immediately ordered H-2S to be installed in all Pathfinder aircraft and as many main force bombers as production would allow. The impact of H-2S on the bombing campaign became fully apparent in the summer of 1943 during Operation Gomorrah. The sustained attack on Hamburg that became the first true demonstration of strategic bombing's destructive potential. Between July 24th and August 3rd, Bomber Command launched 4 night raids on Hamburg, each involving 700 to 800 heavy bombers, all navigating with H-2S. The attacks were concentrated in time and space to overwhelm German civil defense and fire services, and the bombing accuracy achieved with H-2S meant that fires started by one wave of bombers were still burning when the next wave arrived, creating conditions for a catastrophic firestorm. On the night of July 27th, the cumulative effect of concentrated incendiary bombing in the Hammerbrook and Borgfelde districts created a firestorm that generated winds exceeding 150 mph and temperatures above 1,000 degrees C. The firestorm consumed 9 square miles of densely built urban area, killed an estimated 40,000 people in a single night, and demonstrated conclusively that strategic bombing, guided by radar, could achieve effects far beyond anything possible with visual bombing methods. The success of H-2S prompted rapid expansion of its use and continuous refinement of both the technology and the tactics for employing it. By the end of 1943, over 1,000 RAF bombers carried H-2S, and production had expanded to include an improved version, operating at 3 SEM wavelength that provided better resolution and clearer images. The shorter wavelength allowed operators to distinguish individual large buildings and identify specific industrial complexes within a city, improving accuracy. Further, training for H-2S operators became formalized, with navigators spending weeks studying radar images of potential targets, learning the signatures of different cities, and practicing target identification on flights over England. The Pathfinder Force, an elite unit within Bomber Command responsible for marking targets for the main force, became completely dependent on H-2S. Their doctrine assumed that targets would be found by radar, and visual bombing methods were relegated to backup status for the rare occasions when weather permitted. The Germans did eventually recover H-2S equipment from crashed bombers, and they did reverse engineer the magnetron, but the intelligence windfall the British had feared never materialized into a German technological leap. By the time German scientists understood how H-2S worked, British radar development had moved on to new frequencies and new applications, and the magnetron technology, while valuable, was not the war-winning breakthrough Germany needed. More significantly, the Germans developed radar detectors called NACOs that could home in on H-2S transmissions, allowing night fighters to track bombers that were using their radar. This created a tactical dilemma for RAF crews. Using H-2S made them more likely to find the target, but also more likely to be intercepted by fighters. The solution was operational discipline and timing. H-2S sets were turned on only during the final approach to the target, limiting the window during which fighters could home in on the transmissions, and bombers employed electronic countermeasures, including window strips of aluminum foil that created false radar, echoes to confuse both German radar defenses and NAX-equipped fighters. The statistical evidence for H-2S's effectiveness came from multiple sources and was consistent across different analyses. Bomb damage assessment photographs showed that the percentage of bombs falling within 3 miles of the aiming point increased from roughly 30% in early 1942 to over 60% by mid-1943 for raids using H-2S-equipped pathfinders. The concentration of damage within target areas increased proportionally, meaning that the same tonnage of bombs achieved greater destructive effect. German industrial production data captured after the war showed measurable disruptions, correlating with major H-2SG guided raids on specific cities and industrial complexes. Perhaps most tellingly, German civil defense reports and internal Nazi Party documents from 1943 and 1944 reflected growing alarm at the accuracy of RAF bombing and the inability of German defenses to prevent concentrated attacks on key targets. The technological edge provided by H-2S was not absolute. German defenses adapted and bomber losses remained severe throughout 1943 and 1944, but the radar gave Bomber Command the capability to execute the strategic bombing campaign as it had been conceived, attacking targets systematically and inflicting cumulative damage that degraded German industrial capacity. The legacy of H-2S extended far beyond its immediate wartime application and established principles that shaped military aviation for the next 8 decades. Ground mapping radar became standard equipment on all military aircraft operating at night or in bad weather. Evolving through successive generations of technology, from the crude 10-centimeter displays of 1943 to modern synthetic aperture radar that can produce photographic quality images of terrain from altitude, the concept of self-contained navigation, independent of ground-based transmitters, which H-2S pioneered out of operational necessity, became the foundation for all weather strike capability that defined post-war air power. Commercial aviation adopted ground mapping radar for weather avoidance and terrain awareness, and the underlying technology contributed to the development of radar altimeters, collision avoidance systems, and eventually the terrain-following radar that allowed low-level penetration of enemy airspace. The broader principle that electromagnetic sensors could provide situational awareness independent of visible light became central to military doctrine and drove the development of infrared sensors, side-looking radar, and eventually the full spectrum of imaging systems that modern aircraft employ. The human cost of developing and deploying H-2S included scientists and engineers hooted in test flights when experimental equipment failed or aircraft crashed, and the thousands of aircrew who operated the equipment under combat conditions, knowing that every transmission potentially gave away their position to enemy fighters. Alan Blumlein, the EMI engineer who solved critical problems in the H-2S scanning mechanism and display, was killed in June 1942 when a Halifax-carrying experimental equipment crashed during a test flight, taking with him 3 other engineers and the aircrew. Their deaths were not publicized during the war. The secrecy surrounding H-2S prevented any public acknowledgement, and Blumlein's contributions remained classified for decades. The navigators who operated H-2S in combat faced the additional burden of knowing that their equipment made them targets. German night fighter pilots learned to watch for the characteristic radar emissions and to prioritize attacking Pathfinder aircraft carrying H-2S because destroying them would blind the following bomber stream. Philip D., who drove much of the early H-2S development, returned to academic physics after the war and spent the remainder of his career at Cambridge, rarely discussing his wartime work. Bernard Levelvelle, who had been deeply involved in the early radar trials, used his experience with H-2S to argue for funding for a giant radio telescope at Jadril Bank, which became one of the world's leading centers for radio astronomy. The connection between military radar and post-war radio astronomy was direct. The same engineers who built H-2S scanners and receivers found peacetime employment building equipment for tracking meteors, mapping the Milky Way, and eventually detecting signals from distant galaxies. The wartime urgency that compressed years of development into months created a generation of scientists and engineers who understood that technical problems could be solved under pressure if the motivation was sufficient and the resources available. The strategic bombing campaign that H-2S enabled remained controversial long after the war ended, with historians debating whether the destruction of German cities was morally justified whether it shortened the war, and whether their sources devoted to bombing would have been better spent supporting ground operations or accelerating other programs. Those debates continue and are unlikely to be resolved, but they exist in a different category from the technical question of whether H-2S achieved its intended purpose. The radar worked as designed. It enabled bombers to find targets through clouds, and it increased bombing accuracy by a factor of 2 compared to visual methods. Whether that capability should have been used as it was and whether the targets selected were appropriate are questions of policy and ethics that extend beyond the scope of the technology itself. What is indisputable is that H-2S represented a remarkable achievement of applied physics and engineering under wartime pressure, solving a problem that many experts considered unsolvable, and doing so in a time frame that peacetime development could never have matched. The bombers that flew over Hamburg in July 1943, navigating by radar through clouds so thick that crews never saw the ground, represented a fundamental shift in the nature of air warfare. For the first time in history, attacking aircraft were no longer dependent on visual contact with their targets, no longer constrained by weather or darkness. The implications extended far beyond strategic bombing. The principle that electromagnetic sensors could substitute for human vision in locating and attacking targets eventually enabled precision-guided munitions, all-weather strike aircraft, and the sensor-dominated battlefield that characterizes modern warfare. H-2S was crude by later standards. Its resolution was measured in hundreds of yards. Its reliability was marginal, and its operation required highly trained specialists. But it established that radar could turn night into day and clouds into transparent air, giving attackers a fundamental advantage over defenders' hormone tied to visual observation. The scientist who builds a weapon does not control how it is used, and the navigators who operated H-2S had no influence over which cities were targeted or what doctrine governed the bombing campaign. They simply turned on their equipment, watched the cathode ray tube, and called heading corrections to their pilots, doing their jobs as they had been trained while thousands of feet below them, cities burned. The technology was neutral. Its effects were not. H-2S made the strategic bombing campaign possible as it was actually conducted, with all the destruction and all the casualties that entailed. And it did so because a small group of physicists and engineers refused to accept that seeing through clouds was impossible and built a device that made it possible. That is not a small thing. And it was accomplished not with power but with ingenuity, with an understanding of electromagnetic propagation and signal processing, with magnetrons and cathode ray tubes and rotating antennas, with slide rules and oscilloscopes and thousands of hours of work by people who understood that the problem was urgent. The solution was achievable, and failure would cost the lives of airmen and possibly the war itself. Off.